You just throw it out there, we'll go from there.
We've been doing this, is this the fourth show?
This is the fourth one, yeah.
So we have to try and keep it fresh, so we try and, I try and change it up a little bit every night, but I guess let's start...
This makes me want, sorry man, it just makes me want to just, wow. This is cool, somebody bring me a newspaper and a cup of tea. And my slippers.
Alright, so I guess let's start tonight. I have to do 14 of these.
Yeah.
Let's start with EARL SLICK. How did you get the name EARL SLICK?
Oh God, that's well, first of all, I was kind of looking around for like a rock and roll name, you know, especially when I started doing this. We were inundated with what they called the British invasion, not the one from the 1700s, the next one, the 1964 one, and they were sending over Beatles and things, and those names were so rock and roll, you know, John Lennon, Mick Jagger. Those names, I don't know, they were simple and you can remember them. Frank John William Mataloni. Thank you, Mom and Dad.
My middle name's John Williams.
Is it really? Wow. We'll get back to you in a minute. Anyway, yes. So they, thank you, my parents, for giving me all these names. And I tried all kinds of, nothing was working. I would try this, that. I don't even remember them. And if I did, I blocked them out. But I had this friend of mine, he sang in our band, he was about 18 or 19 years old, and he had this thing, we were playing in pubs like 4 or 5 nights a week, like 5, 6 hours a night. You get bored, you know. So he would introduce us, the band, and every night he would throw some kind of new name at you. That's who you would be that night. And because of my Brooklyn accent, he was from Florida, and you know, he didn't quite get the Brooklyn thing. Besides my accent, I would pronounce certain words kind of funny, which I got from my grandmother, who, she stuck letters in places they didn't belong. Like, you know, if you spell Boyle, it's not with, there's no R in there that I could remember. So she would burl an egg, and oil was Earl. And I spoke like this, and he just thought it was funny. And so he started calling me Earl, but not like the Duke of Earl or the Earl of whatever. It was Earl like oil. And somewhere along the way, the term oil slick, you know, like ships crashing and dumping oil all over the bay, was coming into play, and it morphed into that. And so it was a local thing, you know. It was when we would do gigs. I started to become that amongst my friends and everything. It became official sometime around, within a year or less of that, and I had an opportunity to play on like a real album that this band was doing. They hired me to play guitar, and it was for Capitol Records. They asked me how I wanted to be credited, and I just said EARL SLICK, and that was the first time, and I've been stuck with it ever since.
Cool.
At least you can remember it, because it's so ridiculous, you can not remember. EARL SLICK, yeah. We don't know what he does or anything, but we remember his name.
So when did you first pick up a guitar? And why?
Well, I started playing guitar when I think I was 12. Yeah, I was 12 years old. We saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show on their first trip to the States, and you know, needless to say, they caused one hell of a ruckus that night, because every kid the next day in school was like, I mean, it was amazing. I mean, I was a baseball fan, and even when the Yankees, who were my team, won the World Series, I mean, it was great. But this overshadowed that 1,000-fold, these Beatles on the television, and we were all like, wow, those guys are so cool, we want to be like them. And you know, part of it was the music. Most of it, in all honesty, was the fact that you got a bunch of 12-year-old boys watching the television. And panning to the audience, from the band to the audience, and you just see, there was no guys in the audience. If I look at the old films, I couldn't find a guy in there if I tried. Screaming girls, guys with long hair and pointy boots and cool suits, and we're going, wow. That's it right there. I'm going to be that. That's my new job. None of us could play anything. We didn't know anything about music. But by the next day after seeing that, we all designated each other. Okay, you're going to be the bass player. You're going to be McCartney, and you're going to be Lennon, and you're going to be Ringo. And so we put these bands together that didn't kind of exist. Kind of what they do on the internet today. Yeah. A Facebook band we had, only before Facebook. Long story short, in time it turns out that I did like the music, and I hounded my father until he couldn't deal with me anymore, and he went out and got me like a $30 Dan Electro guitar, which was my first guitar, and he basically said, this is it. This is the first and last thing I'm buying you, so if you get good enough to make it work, you're going to have to buy them after that. Great, there's a challenge right there. And long story short, it turns out that I really did have a knack for playing the thing, and I got pretty good pretty fast, in my mind anyway, and I continued playing without any plan or any thought about where it was going to get me, except for the fact that the screaming girls part, that's really what I was thinking. I didn't think about money and fame. It was just, I'll pick this up and the girls will follow me around.
I think who are your...
Sounds like 12-year-old boys, and it sounds like 80-year-old boys. It don't change.
Who are your early guitar influences? When you were learning to play guitar, who were you aspiring to? Who were you listening to?
Well, as I said, the Beatles was really what got my attention. And then what kept my attention was when I saw the Rolling Stones, which in the States, I don't know how close together they happened here. I think it was pretty close, but in the States it was a few months difference, maybe 4 or 5 months difference. And then he had Sullivan again, had the Stones on. And for some reason, I'd already actually had a guitar long enough to kind of have a little bit of the basics down. And when I saw the Stones, that really did, it just hit me. And with them, it wasn't as much of the image, even though the image was great because they were everything that I felt inside that I was very reluctant to act out, like, being sort of a thug, which is what they appeared to be, because compared to the Beatles back then, like the parents were all up in arms about us liking the Beatles, but then when the Stones came along, they really hated the Stones, and it made the Beatles look like good guys. So whenever your parents are on with the guys and think they're cool, then you don't want them anymore, now you got to move to the bad guys. And the music was really the crux of the matter, because everything they did came from American blues or rock and roll. And through that, the Stones, they introduced me to music that had been in the United States forever. From before the Depression days, it was there. It was there into the 1800s when the blues was really about the people working as slaves, and at the end of the day, when their day was long, they'd get together and they'd have some homemade liquor, and somebody would pick up a guitar, and what they were singing about is what happened that day during work. And that's kind of where the blues came from. So I was introduced to a very American art form, the way it was created there. And so I went and, because I'd read articles about them, and they were talking about, Muddy Waters, and they were talking about Robert Johnson, and they were talking about Chuck Berry, and they were talking about all these guys. Some of them I'd heard of, but not all of them. So I went out and started buying the records, and that's how I really learned how to play, by listening to those early Rolling Stones records and the blues records.
How did you get from being in a band with your mates, playing guitar around, to actually making a living from it and earning money?
In hindsight, the amount of time from when I learned how to play to my first band, which was just, you know, God, we must have sucked. We could barely play. But we had a good time, and that's really what it was about. And I think it was only about, yeah, it was maybe 4 years, 5 years max, from the time I started my first really infant band where we could barely play to when I was making money at it. And at the time, it really didn't seem like it was like taking forever to get there, or it was a task or a journey, because the agenda wasn't there. It wasn't like, I took it seriously to the point that I really wanted to play. So the part that I took seriously was sitting in front of the record player and trying to copy the licks and learn the sounds and all of that stuff. I took very seriously. But I didn't think that, wow, someday I'm going to be in a band like the Rolling Stones. I'm going to be as big as this guy. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to have money trees growing in the backyard. Just didn't even occur to me, which is probably why there was never a sense of urgency about whether I was making any money or not. It happened all organically.
And then, of course, you ended up getting this big break and getting an audition for David Bowie, who was also a big star at the time. You've said before that it was Michael Kamen that introduced you to David, so how did you become friends with him? And maybe just explain a little bit about who Michael Kamen was.
Yeah, like any other, you know, life, you know, the funny thing is that when you see what I do for a living, I can only guess that there's a lot of different trades in this audience right now, you know, and at the end of the day, it's really, it's not that dissimilar, even though, well, maybe the way we act and carry on is a little bit different, because if you did that at work, you wouldn't have a job. So I take back just part of that. The other part is though, you still have to work hard. You have to keep your, you know, nose to the grindstone. You have to network with people. In your case, you'll go for a job interview. In my case, it could be an audition, which is pretty much the same thing. And as you do that, and you get better, you meet people. And the difference is, I think, the biggest thing as far as getting to a position of some kind of what you might consider success. If you've gone to school and you've learned a trade, or you learn medicine or anything, or to be an attorney, at the end of the day, it does take what it takes, and it does take some networking, you know, but what you have to have before you even get to the next part is a formal letter. So if you want to join a law firm, you just can't say, hey man, I'm a lawyer. They have to know that you've actually passed the bar and you are a lawyer, or you're a doctor, that you have credentials. With us, there's really not credentials per se. What your credentials are basically endorsements and word of mouth from credible people. And I was very fortunate that through some friends of mine, I met a man named Michael Kamen, who, just to let you know who Michael was, he had a rock and roll band in New York that were all Juilliard School of Music graduates that all studied classical music, that started a rock band. So they were kind of trying to do what ELO did here, where they had that combination of the two. And I met him, and we got on quite well, and he liked the way I played, and he would hire me once in a while to do a session, or, you know, he helped me out a lot. And long story short is, through him and working with him, that was my endorsement and my introduction to David Bowie. That's how I got that job. Now, the job came as a result of me playing live every day, pretty much, every year for a good 5 or 6 years before I got there. So I was ready for the job. I mean, I had what it needed, obviously, because I get hired. But they met by chance in New York City. Michael, in his later life, became a very well-known composer for film. He's done a lot of films that you guys have seen, all the Lethal Weapon movies, Robin Hood movies. He did a lot of stuff, and he was great. And to get an endorsement from a guy like that, when David Bowie says, "Hey, look, my guitarist left, and I need a guitarist, and I really want a young guy who's, you know, a local guy here that that can, you know, fill Mick Ronson's shoes, but I don't want somebody well-known. I want an unknown guy." And Michael suggested me, and he set up the audition. I almost said interview. It was kind of both.
And how was that then? So what you said we had interviews and.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. This is kind of, this wouldn't happen if you went on a job interview, I'm sure. I was actually, when Michael set this up, he didn't tell me what it was. He said, "I just got you an audition. It's like, it's a big one." And he said, "So just get your shit together, you know, the next couple of days, because you're going to get a phone call." And he didn't tell me who it was. And I did get a phone call a few days later from David's assistant, and said, you know, David Bowie. By that time, I think the cat was out the bag. Michael finally let me know who it was, or however I found out. And so they set up an audition, which I would think, I know how they worked. You know, you got a call from a band that wanted a guitar player, so you would meet at a rehearsal, you'd meet the guys, you would play some of the songs with them, and then, you know, you either got a call or you didn't get a call. And so I showed up at RCA Studios in New York, and I thought there was going to be, you know, him and a band, and it wasn't. I walked into a recording session where David and Tony Visconti were mixing an album that it was the Diamond Dogs record they were mixing. And so I went in there, and his assistant, nobody introduced me to anybody. She just walked me into the studio. I said, "Oh, there's your amplifier, you can plug in there, there's some headphones." And I'm waiting for something, there's no band, there's nothing, and I'm really kind of like, okay, but this is weird, man. This is really weird. Little did I know it was going to get even weirder than that before the night was over. And I had a bottle of brandy in my pocket, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm glad I brought this. You know? This is strange. I wasn't even nervous, I was just weirded out. You know, you don't expect that. You know, you go into an audition for a band and there isn't one. Is this a joke? I mean, so if you've ever been in a recording studio, you have a big room where the band would play. Then there's a glass partition, and on the other side of that is the record producer, the engineer, and all the recording equipment. And so when you're recording, you see through the glass, they see you, and that you communicate through microphones when you see each other. It was blacked out in there. All I could see is the little lights on the equipment, the little red lights, remember, like disembodied lights. And a voice comes on and says, "Put the headphones on," and I do. It turned out it was Tony Visconti, and he just said, "Play." I said, "Play what?" He said, "You'll hear music, play along." That was it. Like, it's in the key of G, or it's slow, or it's fast, nothing, no guidelines, no suggestions, and luckily, I really didn't give a shit, so I just played along. How can you give a shit at that point? It's like, okay, I don't even see this David Bowie guy anywhere, and I don't know who this guy is talking to me. Okay, I'll play. I only played for about 10 minutes, maybe 15. And silence, nothing. No, that was good, you know, or you sucked, or nothing. And I just sat there for a couple minutes, and then in walks this odd, skinny man with no eyebrows, paler than pale could possibly be. It was him. And, and the two eyes, they're not the same like other people. They appeared to me to be two different colors, but that wasn't the case. He got injured like when he was younger, and one of his pupils was just big all the time. The other one would go big and small, and this one was just big. And that, and the eyebrows and shit, I'm like looking at pardon me for staring, sir. I'm thinking all of this, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking about it. he must have known because, you know, one thing about David, nothing was by mistake. It was all by design. And back then especially, it was all for shock value. Well, it worked, dude. I'm shocked. Okay? As it turns out, the way he looked and the way he was really didn't match up that well, which was really good. Because he sat down, he said, hi, I said, well, I really liked that. It was kind of fun listening to you play whatever he said. And he had a guitar in there, and I had mine, and we just kind of jammed a little bit. I would say no longer than a half hour. You know, my memory's a little foggy. It was 100 years ago, but after that, he said thank you and disappeared back into the dark room. I didn't see anybody, and his assistant came in and just said, great, well, we got about a dozen more guys to look at, so next couple of weeks or so, we'll let you know what's going on. I'm thinking, wow. Now that I've done this, now I'm starting to give a shit, you know, and I'm thinking, And she says 2 weeks, and well, that's gonna seem like forever. Luckily, they did call me the next day, and she said, David liked what you did, and you know, if you like it, you want to do it, he would like you to join the band to go on the next tour or whatever. And so the next day I went and met with him, and I remember getting there, and he was staying at a place. He was actually living at a place called the Sherry Netherlands. It was one of the most expensive hotels on the planet. It's like right next to the, you ever heard of the Plaza Hotel in New York City?
Yeah.
It's a famous, iconic, well this one's right there, and it's as famous, and I wouldn't have guessed, would know what a room like that would cost them, but it must have been, in those days dollars, a lot of money. I mean, it had a big white grand piano in the living room, and it was wow. And I walked in and didn't know David Bowie there, his assistant, the nanny. His son Joe was 4 years old. And I just hung around an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Finally, he comes in from one of the bedrooms in the back. I guess he just got up and he had a beer in his hand, a beer in that hand. He gave me one. We talked for a while. Basically made it official that I had the gig. And I came back a week later to get fitted for my suit and get ready to rehearse. Now, I guess that's different than your job interviews. I would hope so.
And how did you feel?
Because if it wasn't and you're a doctor, I'm not coming to see you.
How did you feel about the whole suit and the whole vibe of the tour? Because it was obviously a big undertaking, lots of scenery, lots of interesting stuff going on. Was that what you were expecting from that time?
Yeah, it was funny because the backtrack I had was that, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I was listening to blues. As far as bands go, it was the Rolling Stones, Yardbirds, and then, you know, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Robert Johnson, and all that kind of stuff. So I wasn't all that familiar with or savvy to like, you know, the world of music that David was into. Except I did have one album of his called Aladdin Sane. The reason I bought it, there was a song on there called Panic in Detroit, which was basically a Bo Diddley beat, which got my attention, and I loved the guitar playing on it, and that's why I bought the album. But I didn't have the other ones, and I wasn't familiar with them. But I did know one thing: this guy was huge. You know, he was definitely. I think he passed the up and coming point, and he was pretty much what you would, I hate the term, but a rock and roll star at the time. And so I'm thinking, wow, I just got this gig with this big rock and roll star guy. I'm going to be the guitar player, and I started getting real excited about it. You know, and after listening to my parents, especially my father, and everybody back in those days, if you looked different. Back then it was if you had really long hair, certain kinds of clothes, whatever. If you looked like you were in a rock and roll band, or they would actually look at you. If you had long hair, you were automatically a hippie, even if you weren't a hippie. And you know, just getting grief for that. And I go, finally, I'm in a world where I can have my hair long, I can wear what I want, I don't have to listen to anybody's shit, because if they give me any shit, I'll say, hey man, how much you making a week, you know? And so I'm all cool, I'm so cool. And I get to my appointment to get fitted for the clothes for the tour. And David shows me, he's all proud of this, they had a miniature mock-up of the whole stage set, which included, Diamond Dog's album was basically about a future world that's been destroyed. It had big buildings, and it had bridges that moved up and down, and it had all kinds of stuff, and lights, and he shows me that, and then in comes the seamstress to measure me for the clothes, and I really know what, I didn't even think about it actually. I didn't think, what are these clothes going to be like? I thought, oh man, they're going to measure me and go buy me some really cool shit, right? That wasn't the case. They measured me, and then they came back. And then when they came back, there was somebody there with scissors. Oh, what's that all about? That person's going to cut your hair. Really? Okay. Now I'm thinking, you know, my hair was like Jesse's at least, it was longer than that, it was long. I'm thinking, okay, I'll just cut like, you know, a little bit off or something. Yeah. All the way. 1 inch left. That's it. This little, like, it was borderline a U.S. Marine's haircut. It was close. And I'm going, whoa. So off comes the hair. Then I come back the next week and then I see the clothes. It's a double-breasted, checkered suit. What the fuck? And then it really gets bad. They bring these shoes out that go with it. They were old man shoes. They were like business old man. They weren't even like cool wingtips or something. They were lame shoes. And that was my outfit. And I thought, this is great. I finally made it to the big time. I'm in a rock band doing what I want to do, and I look worse than my old man does. This is awful. And I guess it was the universe's way of humbling my ass, because it worked really well. Humility was learned really quick. It didn't take long though, because once we got on the road, I mean, I didn't go near a pair of scissors for a really long time. And by the time we were on the road a few months, he was already thinking about the next thing, and my hair just grew out, and I got me back, and I still have the suit though. I have that suit.
Is it for sale?
It's for sale, because I look at it this way. It's probably the only existing piece left from that tour that David didn't archive and store. He just forgot about it, and I still have it. And I figure if I got that humiliated to wear that friggin' thing in the first place, I might as well make some money off of it. You gotta pay me to make me turn red and embarrass me.